Right. Well, hello everyone. Delighted to say I'm here with Martin Dale from DesignWorks Studios, who's going to be talking to us today about planning permission. Welcome, Martin.
Hello there. Hi everybody.
So, Martin, I'm sure there's lots of people that are going to be very interested in this topic over this weekend, with lots of great projects in mind and just understanding more about what we're going to go through. So we'll cover off kind of little agenda in a sec, but do you want to introduce yourself and talk about DesignWorks Studios quickly?
Sure. My name is Martin Dale. I'm a town planner. I've been doing that role, man and boy, for 32 years. I've worked for local authorities and in the private sector. I've worked on large schemes like 1,000 houses and major infrastructure schemes, waste and mineral schemes, and I've also worked in local authorities and dealt with everything from a porch application up to, again, major development schemes. I'll be honest, the only kind of area of planning I haven't done is retail impact assessments, because even as a planner of 32 years, I find them boring, so I managed to avoid doing them.
Good to know. Cool. Okay. Well, Martin's kindly prepared some areas for us to go through, so I'm just going to share the screen now. So, Martin, in terms of what we're going to cover, then, so you agreed that you talk us through basically what needs planning permission. Going to look at a garden and office rooms, which is obviously massive this year with lockdown scenarios. Where to get advice and potential hurdles to look out for, what people need to think about if they're thinking about demolition and replacing with a new build without needing full planning, and extending to build flats. Seems a pretty comprehensive agenda there, lots of things for you to cover. So thanks for giving up your time today. And guys, if anyone watching has got any questions, then pop it in the Q&A section on the webinar itself, and we'll cover those off at the end. So first up then, Martin, what needs planning permission? How do you kind of define that?
Right. I'm largely on this going to stick to what are called householder applications. So that's extensions to properties, rear and front. So basically, development is defined in the Town and Country Planning Act in Section 55A, and it's engineering operations above and below ground. And also change of use, but we'll stay away from that one. So any works for a house extension, in essence, therefore, constitute development. The next key then is whether it is there are a number of acts, the main one being what's called the General Development Permitted Amendment Order, and Town and Country Planning General Development Order 2015, and that defines what is development, but what is also permitted development. So, for example, you can put quite substantial extensions on your property, especially at the rear or in the garden area of the property, and while they constitute development, they are permitted development. Generally speaking, if you think something's permitted development, it's still best to get approval for that from the local authority to confirm it didn't need planning permission, what's called a certificate of lawful development, because when you come to sell the house, especially if you've got a decent sized extension on it, the other party will want confirmation that you've got planning permission or didn't need planning permission, and that process can take around 8 weeks. So clearly, if you've got 2 weeks to sign contracts over, you don't want to be having to apply for confirmation you didn't need planning permission. So as I say, the permitted development is largely covered under what's called the Town and Country Planning General Development Order 2015, under what's known as Schedule 2, Part A, Class A, and that lists all the various types of development. I've been a planner for 32 years, and it still makes my head hurt when I read through that stuff sometimes. Yeah. So it's always recommended that you seek professional advice if you're thinking of doing something that is permitted development from somebody such as myself or one of the other relevant consultants.
Sure.
So hopefully that just gives you a brief outline in relation to household extensions and what constitutes development and what doesn't. And as I say, there are certain instances, to give you an example, when you can actually put a 2-story extension on property and not require planning permission.
Okay. Great stuff. Okay, thanks for that. So a hot topic this year and certainly going into next year and years to come, I'm guessing, is going to be like the kind of garden office room scenario.
Yes.
So do you want to talk us through? Yeah, so I guess have you seen lots more discussion around this area this year, and yeah, what's required? What do we need to think through?
Again, in relation to office buildings, as they're generally buildings that are detached from the property, they're what are described in planning jargon as buildings for uses ancillary to the main dwelling house. So if you wanted to use it as a bedroom or as a kitchen or something like that, then technically you do need planning permission for them. They're largely, if I say, there are instances, however, when you can argue they don't need planning permission. But to give you a general outline, if you're putting a garden room up, it has to be, as I say, for ancillary use, such as an office or studio or a games room or something like that. If the building can take up a total in area of 50% of the floor of the area of the curtilage of the dwelling, excluding the dwelling and any other extensions you've had. And what people don't always appreciate is that 50% includes the front garden area of your property as well. So if you are putting a flat roof building up and it's under 3 meters in height and less than 2.5 meters in height to the eaves, it doesn't require planning permission. It is permitted development.
Okay.
If you put a pitched roof on it, you can go up to 4 meters in height. If you are within 2 meters of the boundary of the site, as for example that recent one was, then the total height is 2.5 meters. When you say to the eaves, that's to where the roof connects with the top of the building, not where it overhangs or anything like that. And that can be quite critical. I spent some time working as an enforcement officer, and inches can make differences when you come to potentially having issues with the planning authority.
Right.
The other option that's open to you is there are certain buildings that fall within the definition of a caravan. Basically, if you can chuck it in 2 parts and it's under the size limitations, it constitutes a caravan, even though it may look like a Swiss cottage. Generally speaking, those kind of structures are not actually development within the terms of the planning legislation, and as such, they don't exist. Okay. So if you want to put one of those on your property, which can be quite substantial, and they don't have to be for uses ancillary to the dwelling house, as long as you're not creating a separate dwelling unit. Although again, in some instances, you can do that. Those structures would not require planning permission. So if you've got a big enough garden and you can get crane access, that may be an alternative solution.
Yeah.
For
okay.
it. Yeah.
All right. Good to know. Thank you.
And obviously, all this is, if you are in an instance where one of these requires planning consent, then I would recommend that when you submit your formal application, if it is to enable home working, that you make that argument as part of the planning application. The planners won't give it much weight, but it is worth making that argument and that consideration.
Sure. Okay, good. So that's great. And all of this is very interesting for everyone. So where do you go for advice? What are potential hurdles to look out for? Talk us through that.
Right. In terms of going for advice, my advice to you would be either seek out a professional planning consultant such as myself, or alternatively, if the planning authority are willing to speak to you, then contact them. The planning officers don't have a vested interest in what you're proposing, and they will give you honest advice on things. People are often concerned that letting the planners know is going to cause problems, but it shouldn't do. Most local authorities have what's called a duty officer available, usually between the hours of 10 to 4, and if you give them a ring, they will pass you on to somebody or try and deal with your query itself. Again, the majority of councils also offer what's called pre-application advice. Some councils require a payment for that, even for householder applications or seeking householder advice. And you can write to them, you make your fee payment, and they will commit to responding to you within a period of time to advise you, A, whether they think you need planning permission, or B, whether you get planning permission. A lot of authorities will not actually advise you on the merits of your application. That comes from all the years of litigation, and local authority planners have been, the people saying, "Oh, you said it would be all right," when clearly what was being proposed was substantially different from what discussions were held about. So that's my that's my local authority stuff coming out there.
Yeah.
So that's what I would normally recommend you do. As I say, seek out professional advice and or speak to the planners. Again, to reiterate, I would always recommend that you seek formal confirmation from the planning authority through the relevant process, so you have a piece of paperwork that confirms that what you've built didn't need planning permission or was permitted development, and that way it saves a lot of hassle later down the line if you're trying to sell your property. And again, as an enforcement officer, I came across that in numerous cases, and people have losing sales as a result, which you want to avoid.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, brilliant. So this was an interesting one that you'd mentioned in regards to demolition and new build scenarios, and just what to think through in that regard.
Certainly, the new permitted development rights and the new legislation introduced an amendment in 2020, which basically enables the demolition of certain properties under certain conditions to then construct a new dwelling house on the site without actually requiring planning permission. So, for example, if you've got an existing block of flats, you've got an existing kind of general office, or you've got a light industrial use, then you can apply under this prior approval system to demolish the building and replace it with a new dwelling. There are a number of very specific criteria in relation to that and relevant considerations. If you bear with me a moment, I'll just bring some of those up. Sorry about this.
That's all right. So while Martin's looking at that, go for it, Martin. That's all right.
Yeah. So, for example, you would have to submit detail on the prior approval application, depending on the nature of the site and the relevant issues. You would have to submit. You can be required to submit quite a bit of documentation. For example, you'd have to submit documentation related to the transport and highway impacts, contamination and flooding risk issues, the impact of noise on future residents, design and external appearance of the new building, impact of the development on amenities. So, for example, is the new dwelling going to cause overlooking to the adjacent properties, or if you're converting a light industrial unit, are there other industrial units nearby that would adversely impact on the residential amenities of the future occupiers? So what prior approval means is that and again, you may sometimes have arguments with planners on this issue, is that in principle, planning permission has been granted. It's simply a case that you then have to show that you are compliant with the relevant conditions on the legislation. And if you are compliant with those restrictions and conditions, prior approval should be granted. So, for example, an issue that cropped up on the previous lot of prior approvals, which included conversion of agricultural buildings to dwellings, councils were refusing them on the grounds that they were in the open countryside and adversely impacting on sustainability. That's not one of the criteria of the prior approvals, and after various High Court cases, councils had to accept that they weren't entitled to assess that, which you would do for a normal dwelling in the countryside. So again, a similar kind of situation. It's all site-specific issues and relates to the design issues. Okay. There are also standards in relation to size of rooms, areas of rooms, window, and ensuring you get natural window lighting. It includes everything that you need to convert the building. So it would be the width of the land, the removal of utilities, all that is incorporated within the prior approval process. It's relatively new legislation. So again, in my experience with that, there will be bumps in the road as councils get their head around it and grasp what they are entitled to ask for and not entitled to ask for, and the same for developers as well. One of the key elements of it, though, the two key elements to it are, one, you have to have built the development within 3 years of getting prior approval. It's not like a normal planning permission where you can dig a hole and take 20 years to finish it. You actually have to have the thing built. Right. Okay. And unlike all the other prior approval processes, while they it is. So, for example, if you're applying for prior approval for house extension, the council have 42 days to respond to you, and if they don't respond by that date, you are entitled to build the thing. You get permission by default.
Okay.
That clause has been removed from the prior approval for these kind of buildings, and so basically you have to wait the 8 weeks, and if you don't get a decision, the council apply to it. If you apply, the council will come back to you, ask for an extension, or you would appeal the decision on grounds of what's called non-determination. That is, basically they haven't made the decision within the target date, and that opens up your right to appeal. So in some respects, it's how is it different than planning? But it is because the relevant considerations that the council are entitled to take into account are fairly limited.
Cool. Okay. Great stuff.
So hopefully that's again. Sorry, I tend to go through these things a little fast sometimes because I'm used to dealing with this stuff. So if people do have questions, by all means, highlight them up, and I'll try and answer them at the end for you.
Sure. Yeah, and they can get in touch via your profile as well on the site.
Or get in touch with us,
yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, very extensive there. So on this, touch on this point then. So it was about extending your home for flats, and just that, what's kind of involved and considerations there then.
Sorry, bear with me a second. I'm just getting to the relevant bit of the guidance. So basically, under what's now called, again, under the Town and Country Planning Amendment Order, I think it's 2, which was issued in 2020, further classes of development were introduced into the permitted development schedule. Amongst those is the right to extend your dwelling house to provide flat accommodation upwards. So if you've got a 2-storey property, subject to height limitations, you can go up to 2 stories. If you've got a single-storey property, subject again to other limitations, you can go up to a single story without needing. And again, what that involves would be going through the prior approval system. Again, it includes all the works that would be necessary to make those flats habitable. Like, for example, stair access up the sides of the dwelling house if you need to, that kind of element. Again, it's subject to an awful lot of conditions. Bear with me a second, just trying to find those. Right, so for example, it also applies to mixed-use properties. So if you have a row of terraced houses and you have shops below and flats above, and that's 2-storey, then you could seek to put a 2-storey set of the additional 2 stories with flats above that under the prior approval process.
Okay.
In terms of the information that you have to submit for a prior approval application, it largely relates to the details on the drawing. So you have to include details, as I said, of the floor space. You have to ensure what the details of the natural light inversion is. But there doesn't appear to be a requirement to submit like flood risk assessments, daylight sunlight assessments, any noise and disturbance assessments. It simply seems to be, again, a process of a set of plans to be submitted.
Okay.
I would imagine largely it will come down to the economics of the proposal in terms of whether it stands up, because I'm not a civil engineer, so I don't know the complexities of actually physically building above an existing property, especially if that property wasn't designed for that to happen. But it is a new piece of legislation, and again, it is a prior approval, so the principle is established. It just comes down to complying with the relevant conditions. Again, unlike all the other prior approval processes, this does not have a default decision date on it. It's the 8-week process, and you have to wait for that time and then either extend it or appeal for non-determination against the application.
Okay.
And also, like the other permitted development rights, you have to have the entire thing built within the 3 years. If you don't, say you haven't put the roof on it, for example, then you would lose your prior approval, and you would have to apply for full planning permission, because you cannot retrospectively apply for prior approval. So that would get very messy, and you want to avoid that like the
Sure.
plague if you can do.
Yeah, good advice. Cool. Okay. All right. Well, that's brilliant.
Again, we as a company we are seeing an increase in these types of applications,
Okay.
and we're being asked. We've been instructed to deal with a number of these applications. So if it's something you want to do, it's something we can provide relevant support for you.
Super. Brilliant. Okay. Great stuff. So on that note, there's a few questions that have popped up, so we'll go through those in a sec, Martin, but just to sort of reiterate that if you want to get in touch with DesignWorks Studios, if you've got any projects that you're curious about planning or designing or anything else really, they're offering an exclusive offer this weekend for a virtual consultation, and then 2 3D concepts and a design workshop follow up as well for an all-inclusive package price of £250. So if you've got anything in mind, go into the exhibitors area, navigate to DesignWorks Studios. You can live chat to them over the weekend, fill in the form, fill in this. If you're interested, they'll get back in touch, and they'll take you forward from there. So we'll now go on to, we've got a couple of questions that have come through for you, Martin. So I'll just stop the screen and we'll go through those quickly. So first one is in regards to basements. Someone's asked about, do basement conversions need planning permission?
Sorry, does a basement conversion need planning permission?
Yeah.
If it's an existing basement, then no, because to do internal works to your house isn't development which requires consent unless the building is listed. One of the mistakes that people make on listed buildings is that they read the listing and it'll say this building's listed because of the frontage of the building, for example.
Okay.
But the whole building and everything within the curtilage that at the time it was listed is listed. So if you have a 1960s concrete roof garage in there, that's listed as well. So just to be careful, if it is listed, that you then you speak to the relevant conservation officer or planning officer just to check that your works don't require consent.
Sure.
If you're having, in order to make the basement habitable, you're having to do external excavation works to put stairwells in and that kind of thing, those works can require planning permission.
Okay. Great, thank you. Someone else has asked, if I go for planning permission, will my neighbours see it? And if so, when is the best time to tell them?
If you're applying through the prior approval process for a household extension, the way that system works is the local authority will consult your neighbour and they have 21 days in which to respond. Only if they object on relevant planning grounds, not about something that happened 20 years ago, but for example that it's going to overshadow their rooms or cause an overburning impact, do the planners then consider that? They are restricted only to amenity issues. That's overbearing, overshadowing, loss of privacy. They may not agree with your neighbour. If your neighbour doesn't object, and this is the reason for, if you get on with your neighbour, definitely having a word with them and showing them the plans, then after the 42-day period, or early if the planners wish to do it, but at least after the 21-day consultation period, then the planners can write back and confirm prior approval is not required. I would reiterate, when you submit this through the system, prior approval is only required or should only be required from the council if they've received an objection from the neighbours that relates to amenity issues. But you may, planning is something of a large profession, and there are massive differences in interpretation between various elements. So again, if the planners are coming back to you and disputing that, then I would again seek out professional advice and seek a more appropriate view. One of the other elements with prior approvals that causes problems sometimes is that people think you have to build it out of the same materials. That's not correct. It just has to be similar materials, unless you're a conservatory, in which case that clause doesn't apply. So, for example, if you've got a red brick house, then you would need to do it of a red brick. It doesn't have to be the exact red brick, but it just has to reflect what's there. So one of the other things that often crops up is, I've got timber windows, white timber windows. Do I need to put white timber windows in my extension? The answer is no. As long as they're similar in appearance, not material, then you should be all right under the prior approval system.
Right. Okay.
Sorry, I went on a bit there, but
that's a good answer.
That's one of the processes.
That's what it's all about. Yeah. Quick one. Well, I don't know, but like that, how long does a process take, and has there been an impact as a result of COVID on that?
Okay. COVID can impact on them, especially if an application has to go to planning committee. But for most household applications, the national target is 8 weeks from the date of validation. The first day is considered day zero. So they generally have 8 weeks in which to deal with your planning application.
Right.
If they feel it's going to take longer, then they will generally come back. Well, they actually have a statutory obligation to do this, but not all councils comply, to ask for an extension of time. So if they need a couple more weeks, then generally would write to you and ask for a couple more weeks. Some councils are a little naughty in that they include that in the initial validation letter of the application. So you need to be careful on that. If after 8 weeks you've not had a decision, you can appeal on grounds of non-determination, but usually it's worth waiting a couple of weeks, because at current times, I think the average appeal timescale for a householder application with the government's planning inspectorate is around 22 weeks.
Okay.
So you might as well just wait a couple more weeks in most cases. Now, one of the things that can affect the timescale for an application is making sure you submit a valid planning application that's providing all the relevant information. This is an absolute minefield. Whilst most councils have what's called a validation checklist that you can read through and assess, even if you provide all that information, some planning authorities invalidate applications for silly reasons. I once had an application invalidated because a document that I wrote wasn't in the format the council wanted it to be in, which is not a reason to invalidate the application. My experience is path of least resistance, give them what they want, because to go back and argue that they're not actually entitled for this information takes you far longer and usually gets you nowhere. So unless it's going to cost you a fortune to provide the information they're asking for, take it on the chin and submit it.
Yeah, good advice. Okay, someone's put down about moving to a house in a conservation area, and how is this different from a listed building?
Conservation area is different in terms of the fact that you still have permitted development allowances. They're just reduced in terms of the amount that you can do. So again, if you're looking to extend a property, I would be speak to the planning department. In terms of any internal alterations, the fact it's in the conservation area makes no difference. What you need to check, though, because this is an issue again as an enforcement officer when I was looking in the private sector that cropped up, is you need to check whether the conservation area has any form of what's called Article 4 direction, removing some or all of those permitted development rights. So, for example, I had a client who painted the outside of his house, and it turned out there was an Article 4 direction, and the colour he had was different than the colours you were allowed, and therefore he had to. He couldn't really argue about it, so he had to get the people in and repaint the house.
Okay.
The other issue with conservation areas is any trees in conservation areas, regardless of their quality or species, have protection on them as well. So if you have a scraggly sycamore in your back garden that you think is going to crash into your house and it's going to come down, you need to speak to the tree officer in the council to see if you need what's called permission to do that. It's not the same as a tree preservation order in that you just have to kind of notify them of the works, but if you do it without, you can be in trouble. Okay. So especially if someone dubs you in, which is where most planning issues that are for household extensions crop up because somebody's rung the council up to complain about something.
Right. Okay, brilliant. This will be the last question then. So I want to lower the floor in the cellar. The house is a semi. Can the neighbour object as it is a party wall?
The Party Wall Act is a separate piece of legislation to planning. Most planning applications will include, and if you get a decision on a planning application, will include an informative about the Party Wall Act, but ultimately it's your responsibility to comply with that act. The Party Wall Act does not affect whether you do or don't get planning permission. It just affects whether you can build planning permission, because people tend to forget that getting planning permission only gives you planning permission. It doesn't mean you're covered from the Party Wall Act. It doesn't give you the right to go onto the neighbour's property in order to build the extension, those kinds of factors. So you need to be careful in that respect.
Great stuff. Okay, Martin, that's been brilliant. Thanks so much for all those insights. That's been very thorough in such a short period of time. So I know that if anyone's got any questions, obviously to follow up with Design Work Studios and get in touch with Martin through that avenue. And yeah, great stuff. All right, thanks for your time, and hope you have a good rest of the weekend.
Good to talk to you. Hope I haven't put everybody to sleep.
That was great.
I hope they got something from it. Thank
Definitely.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye. So you guys, if you've got any questions for anyone, just go through the Design Work Studios area of the exhibitor section.